But I mean, obviously, some of the money did go towards tobacco control. I mean, I think you would probably get most people in the anti-smoking movement would agree with you that the money from the Master Settlement Agreement, not anywhere near enough of it went towards what it was supposed to go towards. And we should make it clear that, as you said before, you're not dependent on this money. You have no particular axe to grind because you personally are unaffected by it. But what it seems to me that happened throughout the 80s is they moved completely away from education, because they tried education, it worked to an extent, but there were always going to be some people who would smoke. By the mid-90s, you had an anti-smoking movement which was well represented in government, made up of people who didn't just want to educate and inform people, they wanted to reduce smoking to zero. And so, your work was appreciated, I'm sure, by them, but that wasn't going to be the whole answer. The money that was spent, I mean, money still came from the Master Settlement Agreement towards tobacco control, but that money was spent on research into secondhand smoke and, campaigning, or, not campaigning because they can't call it that, but advocacy for smoking bans and other restrictions and tax rises and all the other tobacco control policies, which are, as you would say, against the smoker rather than against the product.
Well, basically, when I was involved with the Tobacco Master Settlement, when I was hearing what was going on, there was going to be 4 criteria. That's all the attorney generals wanted, and the governors, All they really, really wanted to talk about was tobacco prevention and control of spending. They wanted to talk about the taxes and how they were going to, tax cigarettes. Then they wanted to know about how we're going to control youth access, which was going to be enforcement by the law, and then smoke-free air, clean indoor air bills. Those were the 4 things that everybody was talking about because that's what the public was really concerned about. The public really wasn't concerned about research and development. We had enough medical data to prove what we knew to be true about the possibility that if you smoke or chew tobacco for a long time, there's a real good chance you're going to prematurely get diseased and die. Okay, so that was common sense, But when all this money started to go into all the new consulting fees, all the new programs, and then they're saying, well, prevention doesn't really work. And I'm talking about the anti-tobacco movement. These are the experts coming in and say, well, you really can't educate kids because they don't really listen. You can't really teach prevention because you really can't track prevention to see if it's really working. So now we're going to spend, $1 million on Kiss Me, I Don't Smoke buttons, We're going to spend, $500,000 on T-shirts, We're going to spend, all we were doing was perpetuating the myth that tobacco control was really putting health above the financial end of it. And that's not what happened. That's the corruption that I'm talking about, Chris. From the inside out, they used this money when they could have used more money for prevention. The most amount of money that was spent by any one state, with the exception of Washington State, because that's the best state in the country. That's the best state when it comes to tobacco prevention, education, clean indoor air, taxes, and access. Those are the 4. They spend all of their tobacco money on health-related issues. That's the only state that does that. Every other state, Oklahoma is putting it in a trust fund, and they're living off the interest, There's 13 states have taken their tobacco money and reinvested it in tobacco stock or tobacco bonds, so they can now use them as securitization. So everywhere you turn, and every state was different, is what's now causing the stink that I'm talking about. And the stink is that... Go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, a lot of people, presumably in the anti-smoking movement especially, would say that anything that increases the tax on cigarettes is a good thing anyway, regardless of where the money went.
I don't think so at all.
Why not?
I think we just keep hurting the smokers. I think we just keep hurting and causing more stress and not being fair and rational and logical with the smoker.
But they always say, I mean, you're a guy who's involved in the youth aspect, they always say that a 10% increase in cigarette tax, it results in a 7% decrease in usage.
I don't believe it. Chris, I don't know if you believe it, but I don't believe it. I see kids all the time, and I talk to kids every day. And I was down in Georgia, and I had 500 kids in one room. And I asked them, how many of you believe a 15-year-old, 16-year-old, or 17-year-old can buy tobacco illegally? They all raise their hand. How many of you smoke or chew? And nobody raises their hands but 3 or 4. But then you ask how many of you think it's more than 35 to 38%. They all raise their hand. Okay, so I think the surveys and I think the evaluations and the results that are successful that the tobacco control is touting are lies.